Peppa Pig, the Basement Secret. For the past few weeks, Peppa had noticed strange things. Susie, Danny, Pedro, and Rebecca had stopped coming over to play. Whenever she asked about them, the adults would give vague answers. Even Mummy Pig seemed worried but avoided the topic. One night, after everyone had gone to bed, heavy footsteps and the creak of a door echoed through the house. Curiosity got the better of Peppa, and she carefully stepped out of her room. The hallway was dark, but a faint light was coming from downstairs. She crept down the stairs and saw that the basement door was slightly open. Inside, Daddy Pig stood with his back to her, rummaging through some boxes. In the far corner of the basement, there were cages. Inside them, dark figures barely moved. Her friends. They sat in silence, their eyes empty, as if they were unaware of what was happening. Peppa froze. Her breath caught in her throat. She took a step back, but the floorboard beneath her let out a loud creak. Daddy Pig turned sharply. His face looked different, his eyes deeper and darker than usual. Slowly he moved toward her. Peppa spun around and ran upstairs. She had to tell Mummy. Bursting into her parents' bedroom, she saw that Mummy Pig was already sitting up in bed. She looked as if she had been expecting her. For a few moments, they just stared at each other before Mummy Pig stood up, took Peppa's hoof, and led her out of the room. As they stepped into the hallway, Daddy Pig was already there. He didn't try to stop them. He just stood still, smiling. Suddenly, the house went dark. The last thing Peppa heard was the creak of the basement door opening, and voices whispering her name from the darkness. A rush of cold air swept through the hallway, carrying with it the scent of damp earth and something metallic. Peppa whimpered as Mummy Pig tightened her grip on her hoof. There was no hesitation in Mummy Pig's steps as she led Peppa toward the stairs. But instead of heading down, she turned toward the attic ladder. Mummy, Peppa whispered, her voice barely audible over the strange murmurs growing louder from below. Hush, darling, Mummy Pig whispered back, pulling the ladder down with a quiet snap. We don't have much time. Peppa hesitated, glancing back. Daddy Pig remained where he stood, his grin never faltering, his shadow stretching unnaturally long in the dim light. The voices from the basement grew clearer now, calling her name in distorted, overlapping tones. A sudden crash from below sent a jolt through Peppa's body. She didn't want to go into the attic. She wanted to run, to escape. But Mummy Pig was insistent, guiding her up the rickety ladder. The attic was dark and cold. Cobwebs clung to the corners, and old furniture loomed like silent ghosts. Mummy Pig shut the hatch behind them and crouched beside Peppa, her breath shaky. They know you saw them, she whispered. They won't let you go now. A loud thud rattled the ceiling below. Peppa clung to her mother, her little heart hammering in her chest. Then, in the silence, a single voice cut through. Peppa. It was Susie, right outside the attic door. This series was lost and never shown on TV. Peppa Pig, The Descent into Darkness. The day started as usual. Sunlight filtered through the windows of the Pig family's house, filling the rooms with a warm glow. The scent of breakfast lingered in the air and birds chirped outside. Everything was calm. Peppa was the first to step out of the bedroom, followed by George. As always, they headed downstairs for breakfast and cartoons. Everything seemed normal. The same walls, the same rug on the stairs, the familiar sounds of Mummy and Daddy Pig somewhere below. But as they took their first steps down, something felt different. The floorboards creaked too loudly. The air thickened, heavy like the moment before a storm. The stairs felt smoother than usual, as if someone had polished them in their absence. Peppa took another step, and suddenly the floor vanished beneath her. Her body was pulled into emptiness as if the stairs had never been there. She had no time to scream, just the feeling of being yanked downward at terrifying speed. George, following closely behind, disappeared after her. They were falling For a moment, or perhaps an eternity, there was nothing around them, no walls, no ceiling, no floor. Only an endless, consuming black void swallowing them whole. The air was cold and suffocating. It felt as if they had fallen into the darkness itself. Then, impact. A dull, heavy thud. Peppa felt something hard and cold beneath her. Her breath was ragged, her pulse pounding in her ears. She reached out with her hands, touching the ground, damp, sticky, covered in something that felt like dirt, yet softer, almost like living flesh. The darkness remained thick, impenetrable. Her eyes tried to adjust, but nothing changed. There wasn't even the faintest glimmer of light. The air was stale, heavy with the faint scent of decay. The unease in her chest grew into something worse, pure dread. Somewhere below, deep in the unseen abyss, something moved. Not the wind, not dripping water. Footsteps, slow, heavy, purposeful. They were getting closer, rolling across the unseen ground, as if something massive was walking toward them. Then, silence, a stretched, unbearable quiet. And then, something slid nearby, software careful, very close. Peppa felt it before she saw it, long, cold fingers barely brushing against her shoulder. Too thin, too rigid. They lingered for a moment as if studying her. The darkness shuddered. The ground beneath her trembled, the air filled with a deep, muffled sound like a distant rumble. Something was awakening. The darkness was no longer just an absence of light. It was alive. And then the world beneath them collapsed again. They were falling, deeper. And now something was waiting for them. The mysterious shadow. One evening, as Peppa and her family were preparing for dinner, the house started to grow dark faster than usual. Daddy Pig turned on the living room light, but the bulb immediately went out, leaving the room in semi-darkness. Soon, the lights in the whole house started to dim, and Peppa felt that something was wrong. Mummy Pig tried to turn on other lights, but without success. Peppa suggested opening the windows to let in some light, but when they did, there was nothing visible outside. No yard, no familiar trees, just endless darkness. Peppa closed the window, but the feeling of unease didn't go away. Daddy Pig suggested they go outside and see what was happening. But as soon as he opened the door, the entire house was suddenly plunged into complete darkness. Peppa, Mummy, and Daddy stood in the dark hallway, hearing only each other's footsteps and a faint rustling sound. Then Peppa noticed a strange shadow moving across the walls. At first, she thought it was just the play of light, but the shadow became clearer and more unnatural. Peppa tried to call out to her parents, but they didn't respond, their faces empty. The shadow began to move closer, and Peppa felt her heart tighten with fear. She tried to find the light switch, but couldn't remember where it was. At that moment, the shadow appeared right in front of her. It wasn't just a shadow. It was a creature with huge, soulless eyes and a twisted body. Peppa screamed in terror, and at that moment, the light flickered back on. The shadow disappeared, as if it had never been there. But Peppa couldn't forget what she had seen. When she returned to her parents, they seemed just like usual, but something about their behavior was strange. They didn't notice how quickly it had gotten dark, nor were they concerned about the lights going out. Peppa decided she had to stay on guard. And though everything returned to normal, at night in her room, she often saw strange shadows sliding across the walls, sometimes moving as though they were watching her. Peppa Pig. Something is wrong with Peppa. One rainy morning, Peppa woke up earlier than usual. Her room seemed normal, but something felt off. She looked in the mirror and noticed her reflection appeared strange, slightly distorted. Maybe it's just my imagination, she thought, and went down for breakfast. Throughout the day, Peppa noticed her friends acting differently. Susie, usually cheerful, kept her distance and barely spoke to her. During playtime, Susie finally said, "You look strange today." Peppa frowned but didn't reply. Later, while playing in the yard, she caught her reflection in a puddle. Her eyes seemed darker, and her smile was unnervingly wide, almost creepy. She blinked, and the reflection looked normal again. By evening, her family started noticing changes in her behavior. Peppa was unusually quiet, no longer laughing, and her occasional smiles seemed unsettling. "Are you feeling okay, dear?" Mummy Pig asked at dinner. "Yes, Mummy," Peppa replied, but her voice sounded lower and stranger than usual. Late that night, George woke up to strange whispers coming from Peppa's room. He tiptoed to her door and peeked inside. She was standing in front of her mirror, whispering something, but her reflection wasn't moving in sync. It seemed alive, moving on its own. "Peppa?" George asked, his voice trembling. She slowly turned toward him, and for a brief moment, her eyes glowed red. "Go back to bed, George," she said in a voice that wasn't hers. The next day, things got even worse. Peppa became aggressive, breaking George's toys and ripping books. She seemed to enjoy it, laughing in a hoarse, chilling tone that made Mummy and Daddy Pig exchange worried glances. Later that night, loud noises came from Peppa's room. Her parents rushed upstairs to find her standing by the window. She didn't move, but her shadow on the wall writhed and twisted as if it had a life of its own. "Peppa, what are you doing?" Mummy Pig asked, her voice shaking. "I'm not Peppa," she said, turning slowly. Her eyes were completely black, and her smile was unnaturally wide. The next morning, the house was empty. No one knew what had happened to Mummy, Daddy, or George. The camera slowly panned to the kitchen, where Peppa sat alone at the table. She smiled, her eyes still dark and empty.